What I want to do in this podcast is look at some of the misconceptions that underlie the way we view the world around us. I'm going to be specifically focusing on American society for two reasons. One is it's the society I'm from and I teach in, and secondly is just the fact that it's one of the world's most powerful societies, and therefore the misconceptions within American society tend to have a huge amount of impact, way above and beyond just what you might see in the United States. And so that concept, what we got to look at is first we got to sort of pin some definitions down. These definitions are tricky simply because they're so commonly used and they're so commonly misused, or the definitions aren't agreed upon. And yet they're very straightforward, and you have to have some commonality in terms of what the term means, or you're not really communicating to someone else to what you're actually talking about. So the first of these is simply the idea of the culture concept. The culture concept is simply the idea that people exist in groups. These groups share its common identity, common beliefs, common values, in many cases common language, though it's not necessary. But the key here is there's what you might call the norm. Within this group, there's a set of attitudes, values, behaviors, expectations of what's normal, I suppose, in English. And that norm in many ways sort of defines how they see the world around them, how they judge and function on the world around them, and how they judge others in the world around them. And within that concept, we usually call this culture. So there's several key points in here that I think people tend to really, really forget. First is culture's learned. Despite the fascination of sociobiology that people's behavior is genetically inherited, that isn't so. You're not born speaking Hawaiian. You're not born speaking Japanese. You're not born liking, Kentucky Fried Chicken. All this stuff is learned behavior. And so cultures are learned. Generations pass down their knowledge, their beliefs, their values to their children and the other kids, and that generation grows up with that. Now, this also means several things. One is then culture obviously has to be transmitted. This is a very complicated area which really hasn't seen a lot of study, which is sort of shocking. In the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, there was a period of time when people were really fascinated with how do little kids learn their language. And there was a huge amount of study done for a short period of time. For some reason, I'm not sure why, it just fizzed out. People quit looking at it, and there really haven't been a lot of advances in terms of, what you might call language acquisition. One of the really key things they grasp, and maybe this is why it wasn't pursued, is that most language acquisition, in fact, most cultural acquisition, is informal. You don't plop someone down and teach them a culture anymore. You plop someone down and teach them their native or home language. They get this by sitting down, by watching media, by hanging out with friends, listening to their parents and families talk story, whatever it might be. That's how they acquire not only the words, but also the attitudes, values, and behaviors that surround all that. Because language is a reflection of culture. You can take a language and someone outside of a culture can use it. They can use it so they can understand a culture. But you can also have the culture without the language. Many Native American groups effectively are still functional cultural operators, but the vast majority of people who identify in that culture aren't linguistically competent. But that doesn't mean that they're not members of the group. It doesn't mean they don't have the values and attitudes. It just means they don't have that traditional set of words and noises, whatever you want to call it, that were unique to that population. So culture is transmitted, it's communicated. We call this socialization. It's collective. What I think as an individual is not cultural. That's my opinion. That's my attitude. But within that, it will be shaped by the way I was brought up, the way I saw the world around me, the way that people like me talked about what's normal and what's abnormal. That will shape me, and that will shape the way I view the world around it. So culture is always a collective. It's a shared thing. Culture is not what an individual does. And what that also means is when someone says I'm doing something cultural, that's noise. That's not necessarily cultural just because members of the culture do it. It's the context that's key. Cultures are always conservative. If you think about it, older generations are always teaching younger generations their values and attitudes. And in many ways, that's always going to be the optimum. That's going to be the, do as I say rather than what I do. This is how we're supposed to do it. This is what a good person does. And so there's always going to be this contradiction, which I'm sure all of you have expressed no matter what your culture growing up, between what old folks say you should do and what you actually see the people around you in the group doing. This contradiction is inherent to all cultures. All cultures are somewhat irrational, I suppose, in the sense that what they teach and values and attitudes, behaviors are not exhibited all the time, or maybe even a lot of the time, by the members of the group. That doesn't mean they don't hold the value. It just means for whatever set of maybe contradictory reasons, people have a hard time following them through. The other part of this, what this also means that is, since we live in a world of change, not just now, but for the last thousands of years, is that cultures are always changing. Every generation has grown up in a world that's slightly different than the world of their parents. And what that means is every generation is having to deal with things that the old ways don't explain. The old ways don't tell you how to deal with. And so you're constantly having to negotiate as an individual, as in a group, the values, attitudes, behaviors, and whatever of a culture in terms of what was and the right way to do stuff, combined with the reality of the world that you live in, see the 21st century, and just sort of the realities of trying to functionally survive in the 2020s with a value system and an attitude and a set of beliefs and behaviors which don't necessarily are necessarily a good fit with the world around them. So there's this constant renegotiation of modifying culture to adapt to the existing world, and yet at the same time hang on to the aspects of culture which made it unique and made it, what the group believed and bought into. I'm going to think it through this through Bullersdorf's definition is one of the best, I think. It's fairly recent and it just makes sense in a lot of ways. Being German is not simply a description of things. So it's the collective, and it includes not only the behavior of people, but their attitudes, their values, their concept of the world around them, what they see as predictable, what they see as normal, the things that scare them, the things they enjoy. All of these are part and parcel of the collective that we grow up with. And this is why cultures can be so incredibly diverse from one culture to the other, is that, we exist in very uniquely different worlds. And what this also means is the world we perceive is in large part shaped by culture. Culture tells us, in part, what to notice or what's important, but it also is then telling us what not to notice or what's unimportant. And from one culture to the other, these things become radically different, as we'll see in a sec. One of the key things that's to remember is there's two one's a subset and one's different. Society is a subset of culture. Society is the idea of a cultural group within a particular time and place. So, for example, if you're here in Hawaii, you have folks that are from Chinese society who came over in the 19th century, the late 19th century, from largely Guangdong province, especially around Zhongshan. And they're the population that came onto the plantations, and they're a large part of the Chinese population that's the ethnic group here in Hawaii in the 2020s. Now, if you go back to Guangdong, if you go back to the city of Zhongshan, you'll find that they have relatives who never left China. Now, they're all members of Chinese culture in the sense that they have very similar attitudes, beliefs, values. Even if they're generationally different, they still share a lot of that stuff. But the folks that are still living in Zhongshan in China have gone through, 120 something years of life experience that the folks that lived here in Hawaii haven't. So in many ways, they've sort of diverged. And so the word society is when you're talking about a particular culture group in a particular place and time. Because you can have members of cultures who are in very, very different places and at some point have had pretty different life experiences collectively and individually. And so you want to be able to make a distinction between the concept of culture, which is a very shared collective thing, and sort of a subset of it, which would be society. So Chinese society would be different than the concept of Chinese culture. Chinese culture would be much more embracing, much larger. Chinese society would be a much smaller thing, and you want to specify which Chinese society you're talking about. The other one of these, and sometimes incredibly abused, especially in the United States, is the idea of ethnicity. Oftentimes, and this is certainly true here in Hawaii, the term culture and ethnicity become basically synonymous, and yet they're not. They're radically different concepts. And in fact, you see that here with the complications of just to pick an obvious one would be someone who identifies as being Hawaiian, and they're talking using the word Hawaiian culture, when in reality what they should be actually specifying is Hawaiian ethnicity. And they're not one is less than the other, they're just different. Culture is a very sort of coherent, cohesive package. Ethnicity is not, and I would argue that a lot of folks in the 2020s, 2030s are actually part of ethnic groups. They oftentimes will use the word culture, but in reality, what they do is they see themselves as part of an ethnic group. And in anthropology and related disciplines, ethnicity is defined very specifically. It has two parts to it, and you have to have both these parts fulfilled to be a member of that ethnic group. The first is you have to have a self-identity. In other words, you identify as being part of that group. The second part is the group that identifies with that collectively accepts you as a member of the group. There have been a number of cases in the last 10 years or so of individuals who say they're part of something. They're African American, for example. They identify with it, but the group doesn't accept them as a member, for example. Well, that means they're not part of that ethnicity. It doesn't matter what they say they are. It's the fact that you don't have that second part of the second leg to stand on, if you would, for it to work. Likewise, and this is actually not uncommon in the past, certainly it was true in my family, is that older generations, if the ethnic group was devalued, the individual will not admit they were a part of it. So you can have a member of the family who actually, for example, was not uncommon, was Native American, say Arapaho, Cheyenne, Lakota, whatever. But they didn't want to be labeled as that group, especially true in the early 20th century when being Indian was a really bad thing. And so what happens is they don't accept that membership. Now, they might actually be able to apply for tribal membership. So, as far as the group that say Lakota or Cheyenne is concerned, they are a member or could be a member of the group. They could be a member of that population, but they don't want to be. And so in that regard, they also are not ethnic. So the key here, and the other part of this that's really important, if you notice, is these concepts have to do with agreement. They don't have to do with what. So it has nothing to do with, for example, are you language competent? Do you pray the right way? Do you have the right values and attitudes? That might be part of how the group identifies membership, but it's not defined as ethnicity. Ethnicity in many cases is in the eye of the beholder, the individual beholder who identifies as it, and the collective group who says, yeah, we accept you as a member. That's ethnicity. And that's why ethnicity is such an incredibly diffuse thing to grab. It's like trying to grab smoke, because ethnicity is never going to be clearly defined. It's going to be a constantly changing target from one group to the other. It's going to be incredibly different in terms of what makes it up. And you're not going to find any norm to it. Now, what's really interesting about ethnicity, this is true in many societies, it's certainly true in British society and probably more so in American society. If you're Anglo-American in American society, you really don't see yourself as being an ethnic group. If you're part of other groups that were defined as minorities, or maybe in some cases still are, then you can be an ethnic group. But majorities or groups that have power in many societies don't see themselves as ethnic. If, for example, you're in France, the folks that are, technically what you might call normal French, don't see themselves as an ethnic group. They see themselves as French, i.e. the culture or society. If you're from the Southwest and you're Basque, if you're from the Northwest and you're Normand, then those are considered ethnic groups. So as minorities and groups that don't have as much political, social power, whatever, they get identified as what term used to be minorities, but equivalent would be the idea of ethnicity. So in many societies, it's certainly true in American society, when you look at folks that are identified as ethnic, that's oftentimes more a manifestation of the history that at some point they were disempowered or were not part of the establishment that made things happen. And ethnicity is oftentimes was and still is used as a way to disenfranchise a population, to keep them out of the folks that make decisions and are in charge. What I want to finish on is just this idea of what you might call sort of intellectual or conceptual bias. Bias isn't necessarily a negative. Usually it's phrased that way, but bias just means that when you look at something, you have a set of preconditions or preset logics that you're applying to that. And I would argue that, at least from the standpoint of anthropologists, certainly the geographers being more so, is everyone's biased. And just accepting the fact that you are biased is a key part of sort of existing in the modern world in a rational way. But what's really key to understand that is to understand and be aware of what your biases are. So that means it's not that you don't have them. If someone says they're not biased, that's just like saying they're not ethnocentric. It's don't believe them. They are ethnocentric. They're just for some reason hiding it or not aware of it or want to pretend they aren't. So they're living in a fictional world. We're all biased. We're all ethnocentric. But understanding what those biases are, what our ethnocentric habits or views are, is really key to being a global member of the world order, if you want to think of it that way. Unfortunately, in short supply, I would think. So when we're looking at this, what are some of the real biases that are absolutely central in sort of what you might call the Euro-American point of view? And I'm going to use it in a more general sense because I want to get at some point in the future. We'll have another podcast looking at purely American biases that are different than what you see in Europe, or for example, even in Canada in some ways. So what are these sort of general, biases that are part of Western thought, the Western tradition, that aren't found in the rest of the world? And this is the key. It's important to remember the majority of the world's populations, China, Japan, etc., don't have these. And yet, because so much of the world's power and intellectual and economic focus is in what's West Asian or Western European and American traditions, is there's an assumption somehow are the norm and their actual reality when they're not. They're a bias. So the first of these is a lot of the Western fundamental logics actually come from what I would call the West Asian religions or the West Asian religious tradition. This would include, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. They're all built on a common intellectual foundation. They're just basically, in some ways, sorry if this offends you, but they're variants on the theme. The themes tend to be very consistent. And one of the really, really key parts of the themes, or the key emphases, is the fact that people, i.e. human beings, are in a unique relationship with the God and with the divine. And, this is classically seen in the Christian idea of the Old Testament of Noah and the ark, that God's punishing the world or whatever God's punishing. And so he, brings down, water and flood, and at the same time tells Noah to build an ark to basically take the animals and, sort of steward them. And so there's this unique relationship both between people and God, and also people and then the world around them. So people are like a foreman. People are like a zoo manager. They're in charge of the world around them, but people are above the world around them. They're lower than God. They're lower than the divine, but they're above the rest of the world. And so what this means that because people have this unique relationship, West Asian religions could be defined as being species-centric. In the same way that you can be ethnocentric, so your particular ethnicity is how you view the world around you. You see yours as being the norm. We tend to be very species-centric in the Western European American system, where people are in a unique relationship, and therefore we're stewards of the world around us. You see this with everything from the Humane Society to worry about how people deal with whales, to all this type of thing, that somehow people are in a position of authority and therefore responsibility, if you would, of the world around them, because we're in a stewardship of the rest of the world, and we were put there by the divine. This is very much a West Asian peculiar view of the world, and it's not held by the rest of the world. And one of the classic ways you can see this in very minor ways, if you go to someplace like Japan, or if you go to Hong Kong or someplace else, you'll find that you don't see a lot of visible things like humane societies or people being worried about what happens to animals. They have a very different relationship with them. And in part, that's simply because in most societies, especially in Asia and here in the Pacific, people are just a type of animal. People are not unique. People are just one of it, they're just one among many. In fact, in the Polynesian concept, people were actually subordinate to other animals. This is also true of many Native American belief systems, where animals and animal forms are vastly superior and more powerful, and in some cases more intelligent to their human counterparts. And this is certainly true in Asia. You can see this in this image. You have the fox spirits. This is a little outside of a bar in Osaka, I think in Shinsaibashi. And here at the left, you see a fox couple, a married couple of fox spirits. Fox spirits in Inari and Japanese society are very much different and superior and more powerful than people are. The Meneki on the right, the sort of probably sort of drunk, sleeping kitty cat, is again considered to have superior powers to people. And so people are not in a position of superiority in Japanese society. They are not in a position closer to the divine than the other things that live on the planet. This is true in all of Asia, it's true in all of the Americas, and it's certainly true in all of the Pacific. And so in that concept, you end up with a very, very different relationship to the world around you. And we'll get at some point in the future, we'll see as we talk about the concept of clan, which is very much a part of this whole way the world is seen in these alternatives. The classic example, if you want to enjoy yourself, would be to go look at some of the different versions of the videos and or most especially the translations of Sun Wukong or the Monkey King. I recommend highly the Whaley translations that were done, I think, in the 50s. The Monkey King himself is a classic example. He's a monkey. So he's originally probably a mechanic. But he's actually a divine spirit, and he's actually godlike, and he's vastly superior to every person around him. He's actually related to, other divine aspects of the Chinese pantheon. And so you have monkeys in a position of superiority, or at least a monkey, who's a god, who's called Monkey King, or Sun Wukong, the great sage of heaven. He's superior to people. It's very much different than the Western antithesis, out of the Western European American, which people would always be superior. Animals in human-like forms are considered scary and somehow creepy and dysfunctional. The idea of the werewolf, for example. But shape changers who were wolves in Native American societies and in Asia are not. For example, going back to that image, the fox spirits on the left, if you notice they're dressed in human-type outfits, they can take human form. In fact, you'll still hear in much of Asia, especially in Korea, that are beautifully attractive men and women. One of the slangs for them would be that they're a fox spirit. And the sense that the perception is that fox spirits can take human form. They're incredibly beautiful and highly attractive to people, but sometimes they're usually predating or at least using people. So they're more powerful than the human beings around them. A very, very different view of our relation to the world around us compared to the sociocentric or species-centric view that you get in the Western European American system. Now, what this also means then is another part of this is if you have a species-centric view of the world, as you do from the West Asian religions, what also means is you have this idea of what we call universality, where the idea that there's a universalistic way that you can look at the world around you. In other words, all people are potentially, for example, part of that religion. All people could become Jewish. All people could become Muslim. All people could become Christian. And therefore, of course, this is one of the reasons why you have so much religious conflict. If people choose not to be part of a group that they could be a part of, then there's oftentimes some sort of a push that you should punish them or somehow force them to be a part of the new religion. And the logic might be you're saving their soul or whatever the rhetoric is. But the reality is that that potential is there because as human beings, they'll have the ability to be part of that religious tradition. That's, again, very much part of the West Asian religious traditions. It's not part of most religions. And if you don't have that universalism, what it also means is you don't have the universalistic idea of morality. So the classic example we get out of the Old Testament would be the 10 Commandments that God actually gives Moses, I think it is, this set of tablets with a set of prescripts that apply to everyone, the rules for human behavior that are supposed to be followed. And people are going to get judged on how well they, or I should say, how if they follow these all the time, part of the time, the frequency of it, whatever. So what this means, among other things, is you can judge people you've never met, that you do not know anything about particularly, by hearing stuff about them or seeing whether they follow those rules. So those rules can be used as scores. You can judge people. You judge human behavior based on how close they follow to the template of universalistic moral ethical behavior. In most societies, you do not have that. It certainly was not true in Polynesia, and it certainly was not true in Asian societies. Buddhism, for example, in much of Asia has some vague ideas about moralistic behavior, but there was not a concept that you would score other people on whether they followed it or not. There were other things that controlled human behavior and what people did, the right or wrong things, largely cultural, but they were not based on religion. So this idea of universalistic morality, universalistic ethics, is very much, again, out of the Western European American ethos that is grounded in these religious traditions. And it's important to understand that when you're dealing with folks from other parts of the world, if they appear that they're acting unethical, it very possibly is simply because they don't have a set of standardized ethics in many societies. This is certainly true here in Polynesia. is that ethics and morality were situational. The situation, the people involved, the context defined the appropriate morality, defined the appropriate ethics. Not some sort of generalized template that you can apply all the time. And you see this discussion even in American and European societies. If someone's starving and their family's going to starve to death, and they steal a loaf of bread from someone who's wealthy and can afford it. How much of an ethical morality quandrum is that in terms of theft? If you're saving life out of it, in other words, does this moral quandary, or this moral lack in one way, equate to a moral plus in some other? And you're only going to get that discussion when you have this idea of universalistic views of morality and ethics and behavior. So one of these really key concepts of biases that we don't tend to think about, but we constantly judge both members of our own groups and members of other groups on whether they have these. And yet, of course, it makes for a huge amount of confusion because those groups don't have it. They don't use them, and they don't understand what you're getting on them about, because why should I have to follow a set of rules that you abide by? They're your rules, not mine.